It's a Halloween episode! Wait, no, come back. I'm not going to do the voice the whole time, I swear. Throughout the course of a well-crafted interactive adventure, a player will experience many emotions. Triumph, anxiety, satisfaction, anger. Maybe more anger, depending on what game it is. But among all these emotions, none are quite so powerful as fear. In fact, fear is such a powerful thing, there's an entire subgenre of media solely focused on making viewers and players feel afraid. And while well-made horror games are definitely something to be admired, and video games definitely lend themselves incredibly well to the horror genre, I also feel that implementing horror elements into other types of games can create more memorable experiences overall, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Well, I mean, I'm going to be the one talking. You're just watching. Implementing horror into games outside the horror genre is a very delicate task. A lot of people, myself included, barely touch horror games because feeling scared and stressed out the entire time we play isn't necessarily always something we want to do. However, a large part of many games is the sense of satisfaction that a player gets when they overcome a challenge. And a great way to create that sense of satisfaction is to make a player scared to approach that task in the first place.
Hey guys, it's me, Chris. I'm editing the video right now, and I forgot to mention, I think it's pretty important that I give you a spoiler warning before we get into the video, because I'm going to be talking about specific moments from all these games, so if there's any specific game you don't want spoiled, I'm going to put timestamps in the description, so you can skip over any of the games I talk about that maybe you won't want spoiled. Alright, thank you, enjoy the video, bye! Take Shadow of the Colossus, for example. Not a horror game by any stretch of the imagination, but approaching the monsters in this game, especially for the first time, is an extremely daunting task because of the sheer scale of these things. The way the game frames your approach makes you feel so small to the point where taking these things down without getting crushed seems nearly impossible. But it's the only way to move forward, so you gather your strength, make your approach, probably die a fair few times, and eventually deliver that final blow. There's also a whole thing about, whether killing these monsters is the right thing to do and the morality of all that, but it's not really something I want to get into today. Or look at Mario 64. Even further from a horror game than Shadow of the Colossus, definitely. But especially for a little kid, stuff like approaching the eel in the sunken ship or getting the red coin from behind the killer piano required getting up close and personal with some pretty intimidating baddies, and the reward is all the more satisfying after you muster up the courage to do it. It's also worth noting that since Mario 64 was the first 3D Mario game, it feels much more like an adventure through a huge world than its side-scrolling predecessors, so the fear is more impactful in this game than, say, a ghost house from Mario World. The eel and the piano can both be skipped too if the players truly don't want to face them, which may also make overcoming that challenge a bigger deal to the players that do.
Outside of individual challenges, games can also use horror elements to add stakes or atmosphere to their worlds. Being successful on your quest always feels more important when a lot is riding on your actions, and visualizing horror-esque consequences for failure can motivate players to continue their journey, while simultaneously making that journey seem more daunting to complete.
The N64 Zeldas are full of stuff like this. The obvious example is the moon in Majora's Mask constantly hanging over you, reminding you of the impending doomsday you're trying to stop. And yeah, that's a really good example, but Ocarina of Time also employs a similar sort of dread with that destroyed Hyrule Castle town and whatever the fuck these things are. Seriously, what the fuck is that? Despite being mostly adventurous and fun in nature, these games aren't afraid to throw some unsettling stuff at the player, letting you know that if you fuck up, there's about to be a whole other timeline of horrors awaiting you. Another surprising example I don't very often hear people talk about is LittleBigPlanet PS Vita. And yeah, given that subtitle, I guess it makes sense why no one talks about it. LittleBigPlanet has always been a bright, cheerful series, and the PS Vita game mostly follows in those footsteps, but it takes place on a different planet called Carnavalia, and from the beginning, the way the game presents itself implies there's something off about this world. The hollows are pretty off-putting from the start, but especially by the time you get to the last world of the game, things start to get creepier and more mysterious as you make your way through this dingy house, being watched by the hollows and finding out more about them and the puppeteer that created them through these creepy audio tapes.
Oh, please. We have to stop. You don't understand.
The game never strays too far from the classic LBP formula, but the extra layers of atmosphere these moments give the game lend so much to its uniqueness that it's one of my favorites in the series. Also, fun fact, Tarsier Studios, the company that made LBP Vita, went on to create the Little Nightmares series. And yeah, judging by that last world, it was very clear what direction they were heading in.
So, We know horror can be used to make challenges more satisfying, or to make the atmosphere of a game world thicker. In the examples I've used so far, the games usually dip their toes into horror territory without going all in so as not to literally scare off their core audience. But what about when a game straight up says, "Fuck you, it's time to get spooky"? Some games like to lure their players into a false sense of security and then punch them in the gut with genuinely horrifying moments. This can be done with varying degrees of success, and I think that success largely depends on the type of game it is.
For example, The Last of Us is a story-driven post-apocalyptic game, and the encounters are split between firefights with living humans and survival against zombies, the latter of which are usually more threatening. Given the mature nature of the game and the fact that mankind is on the brink of extinction, it makes sense that the player should need to face off against the infected at certain points. And the fact that you never really know when an infected encounter is going to happen makes them a great way to balance out the rest of the experience. The games rarely go full-on survival horror, but when they do, you feel the tension and anxiety that the characters you've grown attached to are also feeling. The best example of this, in my opinion, is the mission in Part 2 when you need to venture into Seattle's Ground Zero for the infection. The moment is built up in advance, and you know when you get there that some scary shit's about to go down. But the game still manages to catch you off guard with the most grotesque infected being you've faced so far. Well, it caught me off guard at least. Wasn't the only thing that caught me off guard either. Undertale is another game that does this, and another one that does it really well in my opinion. The game is full of humor, and assuming you go the pacifist route, it's a mostly lighthearted experience despite some of its darker themes. However, every now and then, moments of terror show up to remind you that this world can be dangerous, and that your actions have consequences, especially if you decide to murder everyone and become the villain of the game.
Also, future me, I apologize in advance for making you edit in that scene of Car. Jesus Christ!
Since this kind of stuff is established as a possibility from the beginning of the game, I don't think the horror stuff later on is off-putting enough to be out of place, despite how fucking creepy it can be compared to the rest of the game. Where I'm less forgiving is, ironically, in one of my favorite games of all time, A Hat in Time. Up to a certain point in this game, everything is super cute and bright and happy and fun, and even when you get to the spooky level, things are still mostly lighthearted and silly. But then, you get to this one mission where you have to go into this cabin, and this fucking ghost lady chases you, and you have to hide from her. This is some straight up Little Nightmares Alien Isolation type shit, and I don't like it one bit. Go ahead and call me a wimp. Honestly, I completely agree with you, and I'll even admit that this, as a horror encounter on its own, is pretty damn effective. But for a game that's all about being cute as heck, it boggles my mind that they would take the horror shit this far. Like, if kids playing Mario 64 were scared of the piano and the eel, imagine their reaction when they get to this. To be clear, I'm still completely in love with A Hat in Time, and I still think it's a 10 out of 10 experience no matter what. But this to me is definitely an example of horror in a non-horror game going way too far for my puny little heart. And honestly, it's this experience that made me want to make this video in the first place.
But Chris,
You may be asking.
you've talked about all these games and their various successes, but what game is the best example of horror and non-horror games?
It's Luigi's Mansion. It's fucking Luigi's Mansion! Fuck!
The absolute crown jewel of horror light games is none other than Luigi's Mansion. Specifically, Luigi's Mansion 1. This game, aside from being perfect in literally every way, walks this perfect line between horror game and cartoony fun that no game since has matched, including the sequels. This whole game is the embodiment of that feeling I had as a kid, of being scared to take on a challenge in a game, but overcoming it anyway because the game made me feel brave. Seriously, I saw this game in a video store as a kid and thought the box art was so scary that I didn't want to play it. But I did, and now I'm going to talk about why I love it. The character designs are creative, goofy, and feel right at home for a Mario player, but the encounters, music, and overall gloominess create this thick, creepy atmosphere that I just can't get enough of. It manages to make its setting just unnerving enough to explore, without being super in-your-face with jump scares or leaving the player constantly anxious about venturing into the next room. And when it does go all out with the horror stuff, it feels like the ultimate payoff of every spooky thing you've faced so far. It's a perfect example of how to implement horror elements into a game without scaring off people who are turned off by traditional horror experiences. And I did mention that the sequels don't quite reach the same heights as the original to me, and that doesn't mean I think they're bad at all. I think they're fantastic. But they definitely steered away from a lot of the creepier elements of the first game in favor of something more lighthearted and cartoony. and in my opinion, lost a lot of what made the original special as a result. The original is short, sweet, tons of fun, and creepy in all the best ways. Seriously, if you haven't played this game, you need to. It's my go-to Halloween game every single year.
Alright, so I've talked about a lot of stuff today, so let's try to wrap this all up in a neat little bow so we can all be on our way and trick or treat or whatever. Actually, maybe that's not such a good idea this year. Horror is cool, and putting horror elements in a non-horror game can make an experience more memorable in the long run, as well as add stakes and atmosphere to a game's world. Making a player scared to face a challenge can make overcoming that challenge even more satisfying. But it's also important to remember your audience to avoid taking things too far. Luigi's Mansion is a masterpiece, so is Hat in Time, but please, for the love of God, don't ever make me play that fucking cabin level again. Thank you so much for watching. Happy Halloween. I'm gonna go watch Goosebumps and eat fistfuls of gummy bears.